I have read hundreds of psychiatric evaluations in my career. I have written more than I can easily count, have sat across from judges and family court attorneys and frightened parents in institutional conference rooms and translated the interior landscape of a human mind into clinical language precise enough that a courtroom could act on it, precise enough that a judge who had never met the subject and never would could make determinations about that person's fitness to raise their own children. I know what these documents are supposed to accomplish. I know the structure they are supposed to follow, the methodology they are supposed to apply, the procedural requirements they are supposed to satisfy before a single clinical conclusion can be offered. I know every technique used to make a flawed assessment sound authoritative. I know all of it because I spent 11 years teaching people how to do it correctly, and because I spent the decade before that doing it myself inside some of the most contested family proceedings the state's courts had seen. So when I read the evaluation that Dr. Lena Holt had written about me, sitting at my kitchen table on a Friday evening in October with the house empty around me and the street outside gone quiet, I did not feel what my husband must have expected me to feel. Garrett had arranged for the petition to be served on a Friday afternoon. I know this tactic. I have advised attorneys on its use from the other side of the consultation table. You serve on Friday because it removes the served party's ability to reach legal counsel until Monday morning at the earliest, and you fill the intervening 72 hours with nothing but the document and the silence and the specific quality of fear that comes from not yet knowing what you are going to do. The isolation is structural. The weekend is the weapon. Garrett had thought this through with more strategic precision than he had applied to many things during our 14 years together, and I noted that with something that was not quite admiration but was adjacent to it, the way you note a chess move that is clever without being sound. I sat down at the table and I poured myself a glass of water and I opened the petition, and I began to read. The evaluation was 43 pages. I read all of it. I read the methodology section and the clinical observations section and the conclusions section and the appendices. I read the citations. I read the footnotes. I read with the particular quality of attention I bring to documents that are going to matter, which is not the attention of a person looking for reassurance and not the attention of a person looking for errors to exploit, but the attention of someone trying to understand precisely what has been built and how it has been built and where the weight-bearing elements actually are. Let me tell you what I found, and let me tell you first who Lena Holt is, because the document cannot be understood without understanding the person who wrote it. Lena completed her psychiatry residency at Whitmore Medical School in 2015. She was in the last cohort I supervised directly before I transitioned from active forensic case work to the faculty position I now hold, and she was, by the standards of that cohort and of the several cohorts before it, gifted. She was thorough in a way that is not teachable. Either a person has the instinct to follow a clinical thread all the way to its end or they do not, and Lena had it. She was careful with her conclusions, which is rarer than it should be. She asked questions in supervision sessions that demonstrated genuine engagement with what a behavior meant rather than simple attention to how it presented, which is the distinction that separates a competent evaluator from an excellent one. I wrote her a strong fellowship recommendation. I attended the program completion dinner for her cohort. I gave remarks. I believe I told them that the most important thing a forensic evaluator can do is resist the pressure to confirm what the requesting party is hoping to find, and to remain in service of what the evidence actually shows, regardless of who finds the conclusion useful or inconvenient. I have thought about those remarks many times in the months since I read what Lena wrote about me. The evaluation's methodology section opened with 3 citations. The first was a paper I had published in the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry in 2011, a paper on the foundational framework for competency assessment in family court proceedings that has been assigned reading in forensic psychiatry residency programs at 11 universities for the past 8 years. The second was a chapter 1 had contributed to a clinical textbook on custody evaluation published in 2013. The chapter on distinguishing genuine behavioral patterns from isolated incidents in multi-session assessment contexts. The third was the National Standards Guidelines issued by the American Association of Forensic Psychiatry in 2019, the document that governs the procedural requirements for forensic psychiatric evaluations in custody proceedings in this jurisdiction and in 14 other states. I am the lead author of the 2011 paper. My name is on the spine of the 2013 textbook. I chaired the drafting committee that produced the 2019 standards document, and my name appears on its cover page, and I am currently serving my second consecutive term as chair of the National Standards Committee that maintains and updates it. Lena had built a clinical case against me, and she had built its methodological foundation entirely out of my own published work. She had not noticed. That was the thing I had to sit with before I could think about anything else. She genuinely had not noticed, because when you are trained inside a system of thought long enough, you stop seeing whose thinking it originally was. It simply becomes the way you think. Lena had learned to practice forensic psychiatry in my seminar rooms and under my supervision, and the framework I had given her had become her own professional skin, and she had applied it to the woman who built it without recognizing the architecture. The evaluation's clinical conclusions were organized under 3 headers: emotional regulation, relational stability, and parenting capacity. I want to address each of them with precision, because understanding exactly what Lena wrote and exactly what was wrong with it is necessary for understanding everything that came after. Under emotional regulation, Lena had documented what she described as a pattern of affective constriction alternating with episodes of disproportionate reactivity. This is clinical language for a person who runs emotionally cold most of the time and then periodically exceeds expected emotional limits in a way that is inconsistent with the situation. The characterization was not invented. I am not a person who expresses emotion freely in professional or semi-professional contexts. I have spent my career observing the emotional processes of others with clinical precision, and I am aware, with an awareness I have been developing actively for 20 years, that this professional orientation has shaped my personal one in ways that are not always comfortable for people in close proximity to me. The constriction characterization was close to accurate. The disproportionate reactivity characterization was not, and it was the piece of the evaluation that told me most clearly what Garrett had done with his 3 sessions with Lena. He had given her specific incidents, stripped of context, and she had accepted them as representative pattern rather than examining them against the broader clinical picture. Under relational stability, Lena had documented what she described as long-standing patterns of emotional withdrawal, difficulty sustaining reciprocal intimacy, and a tendency to retreat into professional identity when the marital relationship placed demands on her. This section was built almost entirely from what Garrett had told her. I know this because the specific incidents referenced in the clinical observations had the texture of Garrett's narration. They were factually accurate, selectively rendered, and arranged to tell a story that the unselected whole would not support. A person can be described as emotionally withdrawn by selecting the 7 or 8 occasions across 14 years when they were not fully present and presenting those occasions as the characteristic rather than the exception. Garrett had done this with skill. I did not underestimate the skill. Under parenting capacity, Lena had written the sentence that I read twice, and then set the document down, and then picked it back up, and then sat very still for a while with the window behind me and the empty yard outside it. Dr. Ashford presents with a professional orientation that has become primary at the expense of familial investment, and whose capacity to attune to her children's emotional needs may be compromised by long-standing patterns of interpersonal distance. I want to tell you what I know about my children before I tell you what I did next, because the parenting capacity section is where the evaluation went furthest from the truth, and the truth matters here. We have 2 children. Cecily is 12. She is precise and watchful and reads everything she can find, processes her feelings by thinking through them rather than by expressing them in the moment, asks questions that sound philosophical but are usually about something specific she is trying to work out. She has had this quality since she was small, this tendency to examine rather than react, and I recognized it in her from the beginning because it is the way my own mind works. I have spent years creating a particular kind of space with Cecily, one in which that quality is not something she needs to manage or apologize for, in which being a person who thinks carefully before she speaks is not a deficit but a form of intelligence. I do not know if I have done this well. I know I have done it deliberately, and with more awareness of what I was trying to create than most parents bring to the equivalent project, because understanding what a person's mind needs in order to develop well is what I have spent my professional life learning how to do. Owen is 9. He is his own entire category. He is loud and physical and emotionally transparent in a way that Cecily is not, and that Garrett is not, and that I am not, and I have always found his transparency deeply reassuring, because a child who feels things openly is a child whose feelings are safe. Owen comes to me when he is frightened. He has since he was 4. Not to Garrett, not to his grandmother, not to the school counselor he likes. To me. I do not say this as a point in a legal argument, though it became one. I say it because it is the most accurate description of what I know about my younger child, that when the world becomes too much, he comes and finds me, and something in what I have built with him over 9 years makes that feel like the right place to go. These are the children Lena's evaluation characterized me as potentially unable to attune to. I read the conclusion section a third time, and this third reading was where I noticed the detail that changed the shape of everything. In the methodology section, in addition to the 3 citations I had already registered, there were cross-references to 2 specific procedural requirements. The first was the requirement, contained in the State Board's 2021 Guidelines for Court-Ordered Custody Evaluations, that all interview sessions conducted as part of a custody proceeding be disclosed to the evaluated party as part of that proceeding prior to the session's beginning. The second was the requirement, contained in the same document, that an evaluation conducted at the request of one party disclose the existence and nature of that financial relationship in writing to the evaluated party before the evaluation commences. And the third, contained in both the State Board's document and the standards guidelines I had chaired the drafting of, was the requirement that a clinical conclusion about parenting capacity in a custody proceeding be grounded in no fewer than 4 direct observational contacts with the parent being evaluated, which could include interview sessions, home visits, or structured interaction assessments conducted with the children present. I had participated in 3 interview sessions with Lena over the preceding 2 months. Garrett had arranged those sessions and I had attended them, understanding them to be what Garrett told me they were, a structured marital wellness assessment recommended by his therapist, intended to give an outside clinician a clear picture of the relational dynamics in our marriage so that we might have a productive framework for the separation conversations we had been having. I had attended because I had not yet been served with divorce papers, because I did not yet know that the separation had moved from a conversation Garrett and I were having to a legal proceeding he had already initiated, and because nothing in Lena's presentation of herself or the sessions had suggested they were anything other than what Garrett had described. I had not been told the sessions were a custody evaluation. Lena had not disclosed her financial relationship with Garrett's attorney. And she had conducted 3 interview sessions, none of which involved my children, and had offered clinical conclusions about my parenting capacity without conducting a single observational contact in which she watched me with Cecily or Owen. 3 procedural requirements. 0 of them satisfied. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I understood this fully. The house was very quiet. The neighbor's dog was moving through the yard next door, unhurried, purposeful, entirely self-contained. I watched the dog for a while and I thought carefully about what I was looking at, because the procedural failures were significant but they were not the whole picture, and I needed to understand the whole picture before I decided what to do with any of it. What I was looking at was a document that was technically competent on its surface, written in the correct clinical register, organized according to the correct structural template, citing the correct methodological authorities, and procedurally deficient in 3 specific, documentable, professionally significant ways. What I was also looking at was a document that had been produced by someone I had trained, using a framework I had built, at the request of a man who had calculated that I would not know how to fight it. He had made a specific error. He had assumed that the credentials I stopped using in active practice in 2016 were credentials I had also stopped understanding. He had assumed that a professor was no longer a practitioner, that an academic was no longer an expert, that the person who had moved from the courtroom into the lecture hall had left her expertise in the courtroom when she went. He had not considered the possibility that the person he was trying to characterize as professionally overinvested and parentally inadequate was the person who had written the rules by which the characterization was supposed to be judged. I got up from the table. I put the evaluation on the counter. I went to my study and opened the filing cabinet where I keep printed copies of my published work, and I pulled out the 2011 paper and the standards guidelines and the 2019 procedural requirements, and I set all of them on the desk beside a fresh legal pad. I opened my laptop. I opened a new document. Then I began to write notes. Not angry notes. Not panicked notes. The kind of notes you make when you are conducting a systematic analysis of the specific failures in a piece of clinical reasoning, and you need to be methodical about each one before you take it into a room where methodical precision will be the only thing that matters. I wrote for 4 hours. When I stopped, it was not because I was finished, but because I had reached the limit of what I could usefully do without legal counsel, and I needed to sleep, and I needed to be fully functional Monday morning when I called an attorney. Before I slept, I thought about Cecily and Owen at Garrett's mother's house, about Cecily probably reading in the guest room and Owen probably trying to get Garrett's mother's elderly terrier to do things the dog was not capable of doing, and I thought about what kind of mother I wanted them to see when all of this was finished. Not what kind of expert witness. Not what kind of legal opponent. What kind of mother? The answer to that question was the same answer it had always been. And the fact that I had the same answer at the end of this day as I had at the beginning was something I held on to while I turned off the study light and walked down the hall. Then I went to sleep. Monday morning I called 3 law firms before I found Patricia Wren. The first firm I called had a family law department and a good reputation, but when I described the situation to the associate who took my call, she immediately suggested challenging the evaluation on the grounds of evaluator bias. And while that was not wrong, it was also not what I needed. I needed someone who understood that the situation I was describing was not primarily about bias, it was about procedure and methodology, and that the procedural argument was both stronger and more interesting than the bias argument, and that an attorney who could not immediately see the difference was not the attorney for this case. I thanked her and called someone else. The second firm was better. The partner I spoke with had handled custody cases involving competing psychological evaluations, and she understood what I was describing in a substantive way. But when I mentioned the standards document and my role in producing it, she paused for a moment and then said, "That's a complicated position to be in," which was the answer of someone who was already worried about what the judge would think rather than someone who was excited about what the argument could be, and I needed someone excited. The third call was to Patricia. Patricia listened to me for 16 minutes without interrupting. I know it was 16 minutes because I was watching the clock in the way you watch the clock when you are trying to gauge how long someone is willing to actually listen before they start talking. 16 minutes is a long time to listen without interjecting, which means either you are composing your response while the person talks, which produces a certain quality of silence that I can detect, or you are genuinely absorbing what you are being told. Patricia's silence had the texture of the second kind. When she spoke, she said, "Tell me about the standards document." Not about the evaluation. Not about the custody dispute. The standards document. I told her. I told her about the 2019 guidelines, what they required, what the procedural provisions specified, who had drafted them and why and under what mandate. I told her about the disclosure requirements and the observational contact minimum and the financial relationship disclosure provision. I told her about the 2021 State Board guidelines that had incorporated those requirements into the jurisdictional framework for court-ordered evaluations. I told her about the 3 ways the evaluation Lena had produced failed to meet those requirements. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And you currently chair the committee that maintains the document?" I said yes. She said, "And the evaluator cited the document in her methodology section?" I said yes. She said, "I want everything you have on the procedural requirements before Thursday morning. I want it organized by specific requirement and cross-referenced against the specific provisions of the evaluation that fail each one. Bring it to my office at 9. I told her I already had it. I had drafted most of it Friday night. A brief pause. Then she said, "I'll see you Thursday." Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and the conference room where we met had windows looking east toward the park, and I found those windows useful throughout our 2 hours together in the way I always find large, calm, open things useful when everything nearby is moving quickly. Patricia read my procedural analysis while I sat across from her, and I watched her read it the way I watch people who matter read documents that matter. She was a careful reader. She went slowly on the sections that required careful reading and moved through the ones that were clear, and she did not perform engagement or pretend to have processed something she had not. When she stopped and went back, I noted it. She went back 3 times. Once at the disclosure requirements section, once at the financial relationship provision, once at the observational contact minimum. When she finished, she set the document down and looked at me and said, "This evaluation cannot stand as filed. Not in its current form. Not in this jurisdiction." I said, "I know." She said, "So the question becomes what we do about it. And I want to give you 2 options because they lead to different places." The first option was a procedural challenge: file a motion to exclude the evaluation on admissibility grounds, argue the 3 procedural deficiencies, and ask the court to strike the document from the record. The advantage of this approach was that it was clean and almost certainly successful on at least 2 of the 3 grounds. The disadvantage was that if the evaluation was excluded, Garrett's attorney would immediately file a request for a new evaluation with a different evaluator, and the process would begin again. The second option was to allow the evaluation into evidence and challenge its methodology in open court. This was slower and more complex, but it produced a different kind of outcome, not simply the exclusion of a document, but a judicial record showing precisely what the document was, who produced it, under what circumstances, with what failures, and at whose instruction. I thought about those 2 options for approximately 8 seconds. I said, "The second option." Patricia nodded. She said she had expected that. We spent the rest of the 2 hours building the strategy. What Patricia needed from me was specific: a complete credential statement demonstrating my current active status in forensic psychiatry, including the committee chair position and its ongoing responsibilities, documentation of my authorship of the cited papers and the standards guidelines, the procedural deficiency analysis I had already produced, and a formal request for a court-appointed neutral evaluator whose methodology would be required to conform to the published standards I had authored. We would also be filing a motion for temporary joint custody during the evaluation period, on the grounds that there was no substantive basis for a change to the existing arrangement while the original evaluation was under challenge. I could produce everything she needed. Most of it was already in my filing cabinet. What I also needed to understand, and what Patricia began helping me see that Thursday, was the full architecture of what Garrett had built. Because the evaluation was the most visible piece, but it was not the only piece, and the other pieces required different responses. Garrett had organized his custody case around 3 arguments. The first was the psychiatric evaluation, which I have already described. The second was a scheduling argument. He was claiming that my professional obligations made me structurally unavailable for the consistent daily care that children at Cecily and Owen's ages require, and he was going to support this with employment records showing my average weekly hours and my professional travel calendar. The third was historical, and it was the most carefully constructed of the 3 because it was built entirely out of things that were true, and truth assembled in a particular sequence can become something that is no longer accurate even though nothing in it is false. Over 14 years of marriage I had missed school events. Not many, and not without reason, but some. I had been late to pick up on occasions when a case overran its timeline or a deadline extended past what I had anticipated. There had been years, particularly during the research periods and during the cycles of preparing the standards revisions for committee vote, when I had been less present in the evenings than any of us had wanted. Garrett had been documenting these instances. He had dates. He had specific occasions. His attorney had declarations from Garrett's mother and from a neighbor who had been present at various family gatherings and observed the pattern of my absence. None of it was fabricated. That was the piece I kept returning to, that required the most honest thought, Because the instinct when you are being characterized as something you are not is to argue that the characterization is false. But Garrett had not given Lena false information, and he had not given his attorney false information. He had given them selected information arranged with a frame that the unselected whole would not support. He had done to me in a legal proceeding exactly what I had published papers warning evaluators against. He had identified a pattern in a carefully chosen subset of data and presented the subset as if it were representative of the full dataset, and because he knew me, because he had spent 14 years observing me, he knew exactly which data to choose. Understanding this was both professionally clarifying and personally painful in a way I want to name without overstatement. I am not a person who underestimates her own limitations. I know I have not always been as present as I should have been. I know there were periods when my professional world demanded a quality of immersion that left less of me for the domestic one, and I know that Garrett carried weight during those periods that I did not always fully acknowledge. I was not a bad mother, I was not an absent mother, but I was also not the most present mother I could have been in every season of the 14 years, and sitting honestly with that, without defense mechanisms and without minimizing it, was something I had to do before I could argue against what Garrett was claiming. Because arguing from a position of denial would not work. I needed to argue from a position of accuracy, which required me to first be accurate with myself. What Garrett's documentation left out, what his declarations did not and could not capture, was the texture of what I gave my children that his version of the narrative had no frame for. The specific understanding I had built with Cecily about how her mind worked, which I had built because her mind worked the way mine did and I had spent years learning to give that kind of mind what it needed. The specific safety I had created with Owen, the particular quality of presence that made him seek me out when the world became frightening, that had not been designed or scheduled but had been grown over 9 years of small consistent choices. These things would not appear on a calendar or in a declaration from a neighbor who had observed me leave early from a barbecue. They existed in my children, in what they knew they could rely on, in the patterns of trust that are invisible to outside observers and legible only to the people inside them. Dr. Peel would eventually find them. But I did not know that yet. Patricia filed the temporary joint custody motion and the procedural challenge within 2 weeks of our initial meeting. The procedural challenge asked the court to either exclude the Holt evaluation or stay the proceedings pending a full methodological review, and it attached my credential statement, the procedural deficiency analysis, and a request for appointment of a neutral evaluator under court mandate. It also noted, in plain and specific language, that the evaluator who had produced the challenged document had been trained under the supervision of the person she had evaluated, and that the methodological framework she had cited as her authority had been authored by that same person, and that neither of these facts had been disclosed to the court or to opposing counsel at the time the evaluation was submitted. Garrett's attorney filed an opposition within the week. He argued that the evaluation was procedurally sufficient, that the disclosure requirements were guidelines rather than mandatory standards, that the request for neutral evaluation was a delay tactic, and that delay was not in the interests of the minor children. The filing was competent and the financial disclosure argument was not meritless, but the other two positions were substantially weaker than he had apparently assessed them to be, because they required him to argue against specific language in the state board's own procedural document, which is a position that tends to fare poorly in front of judges who have read the document. Judge Christine Adler had clearly read the document. She scheduled a hearing. The 2 weeks between the filing of Patricia's motion and the hearing were among the more difficult weeks of the preceding months, not because the legal situation was unclear, it was becoming clearer, but because the emotional situation was complicated in ways the legal situation could not address. Cecily and Owen were in the temporary arrangement that predated the formal proceedings, alternating weeks, which had been the informal pattern since Garrett and I had separated. During the weeks they were with me, the house felt correct and full in the specific way it feels full when the people who belong in it are there. During the weeks they were at Garrett's I went to work and came home and worked in the evenings and did not, by a significant effort of will, allow myself to spend those hours in the particular kind of anticipatory fear that the proceedings were designed to generate. One evening during the second week before the hearing, I was at my desk reviewing the procedural deficiency analysis one more time when I found myself thinking about Lena with a specificity I had been avoiding. Not about what she had done, but about the moment when she would understand fully what she had done. I had thought about this before and kept it at arm's length, but that evening I let myself sit with it. At some point during the legal process, Lena was going to discover that the evaluation she had written failed 3 of the procedural requirements contained in the document she had cited as her methodological authority, and that the document had been written by the person she had evaluated, and that the person she had evaluated had been her own supervisor during her residency. She was going to have to sit with all of that and decide what it meant about the work she had done and the professional judgment she had exercised. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I want to be precise, what I felt was closer to a particular kind of professional grief, the kind that comes from watching someone you trained not live up to the standard you built them to meet. I had believed in Lena as a resident. I had written her a strong recommendation. I had told her cohort that the most important thing a forensic evaluator could do was resist the pressure to confirm what a requesting party hoped to find. She had not resisted it. And some part of the responsibility for that, I thought, sitting at my desk in the quiet house, belonged to the field itself, to the system that trains careful people and then places them in financial arrangements with one side of a contested proceeding and expects them to remain fully independent. It is a structural vulnerability I have written about and which the standards guidelines address but cannot eliminate. I thought about this for a while. Then I closed the analysis document, made tea, and went to bed. Judge Adler excluded the Holt evaluation on 2 of the 3 procedural grounds. The ruling came at the end of the hearing, after 2.5 hours that I want to describe in detail because the hearing itself was where the architecture of the case became fully visible to everyone in the room, including the people who had built it. Garrett and his attorney were at their table when Patricia and I came in. Garrett looked at me when I entered, and I looked back, and we held that for a moment, and then I sat down. We had been married for 14 years. We had 2 children. We had built a life together that had real things in it even as the marriage itself had been failing, and I was aware of all of that and I set it aside and opened my folder. The judge opened by asking Garrett's attorney to describe the basis on which he was defending the evaluation's admissibility. He argued 3 positions. First, that the procedural requirements cited by opposing counsel were aspirational guidelines rather than mandatory standards. Second, that the sessions conducted by Dr. Holt had been adequately disclosed to the opposing party through the general context of the marital situation. And third, that the 3-session interview structure satisfied the spirit if not the specific letter of the observational contact requirement. Judge Adler asked him to point her to the specific language in the state board document that characterized the procedural requirements as aspirational rather than mandatory. He found the provision. He read it. The provision said shall. Not should. Shall. The judge wrote something down. Then she asked whether the framing of the sessions as a marital wellness assessment, rather than as a custody evaluation, had been disclosed to Dr. Holt as the framing the requesting party intended to use in presenting the sessions to the opposing party. His answer required multiple sentences to say yes. The judge asked whether Dr. Holt had understood, at the time of the sessions, that the sessions were being presented to the opposing party as something other than what they were. He said he could not speak to Dr. Holt's understanding. The judge said she wanted to hear from Dr. Holt directly, and called a brief recess. In the hallway, Patricia stood beside me and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She's already made up her mind on the disclosure ground. The observational contact ground is going to go the same way. The only question is whether she rules on the financial relationship provision." I said I thought she would leave the financial provision for later. The other 2 were sufficient, and judges in family court are generally reluctant to produce rulings that could read as sanctions against an attorney unless the record is unambiguous. Patricia thought about that. She said, "Probably right." We went back in. Lena came in after the recess. She was composed in the way she had always been composed, the quality of stillness she had as a resident that I had noted as a professional strength without examining closely enough what it was protecting. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the judge and at Garrett's attorney and at Patricia and did not look at me, which I registered without reacting to. The judge asked her to describe the procedural steps she had followed in commencing the evaluation. Lena described them. She had received a referral from Garrett's attorney's office, she said, describing the case as a marital wellness consultation requested by one party as part of a separation process. She had conducted intake, established a session schedule, and conducted 3 interview sessions. The judge asked whether she had provided a written disclosure to Dr. Renata Ashford describing the nature of the evaluation prior to the first session. Lena said no. She had understood the sessions to be a wellness consultation and had not characterized them as a custody evaluation in her communications with Dr. Ashford. The judge asked, who characterized the sessions as a wellness consultation? Lena said the referral from the attorney's office had used that framing. The judge looked at Garrett's attorney for a moment with an expression I have learned, over years of watching judges in family court, to recognize as professional restraint applied to significant impatience. Then she asked Lena whether, given that her conclusions addressed parenting capacity and would be submitted in a custody proceeding, she had considered whether the evaluated party should have been informed of the forensic context of the sessions before they began. Lena said, I relied on the referral framing. The judge wrote something. She wrote for some time. Then she asked Patricia whether she wished to examine Dr. Holt further. Patricia said yes. Patricia asked Lena to confirm the number of sessions she had conducted with Dr. Renata Ashford. 3 sessions, Lena confirmed. Patricia asked whether any of those sessions had involved observation of Dr. Ashford with her children. Lena said no. Patricia asked Lena to describe the minimum observational contact requirement in the National Standards Guidelines for Custody Evaluation, citing the document by name. Lena described it. For contacts minimum. The standard had been in the document for 6 years. It was one of the provisions I had advocated most firmly for during the 2019 drafting process because the research on parenting assessment consistently showed that interview-based evaluations without observational components produced significantly less accurate conclusions about parenting behavior. Patricia asked Lena who had authored the National Standards Guidelines document she had just cited. Lena said the document was produced by the National Standards Committee. Patricia said, and who chairs the National Standards Committee? A pause. Not a long one. Enough. Lena said, Dr. Renata Ashford. Patricia asked whether, when she accepted the referral to evaluate Dr. Renata Ashford, she had known that Dr. Ashford was the current chair of the Standards Committee whose guidelines she would be using as her methodological framework. A longer pause. Then, no. Patricia asked whether Lena had trained under Dr. Ashford during her residency. Yes. Whether the methodological framework she had applied in the evaluation was one she had been taught, in part, by Dr. Ashford. Yes. Patricia asked whether, having now understood those facts, she believed the procedural requirements of the standards document had been fully met in the evaluation she had conducted. Garrett's attorney objected. The judge sustained the objection. It did not matter. The question had been asked in front of Judge Adler and the answer had been implicit in the pause before the objection. Patricia sat down. The judge excluded the Holt evaluation on the disclosure ground and the observational contact ground. She noted the financial relationship provision in her written order but declined to rule on it, stating that the 2 grounds she had ruled on were sufficient to support the exclusion. She also granted the temporary joint custody arrangement, which meant that Cecily and Owen would return to the alternating schedule that had been in place before Garrett filed, and she ordered the appointment of a neutral forensic evaluator from the court's approved panel. The evaluator appointed was Dr. Sandra Peel. I did not know Sandra personally. This was appropriate. She had a 17-year career in forensic evaluation with no record of procedural challenge in any of her court appointments, which told me she was methodical, and when she contacted both parties within a week of her appointment she sent a formal disclosure document that outlined the nature of the evaluation, her appointment, the access both parties and the court would have to her findings, and her procedural timeline. Her timeline included 4 interview sessions with each parent, 2 sessions with each child individually, and 2 structured observational sessions for each parent with both children present. This is what the standards require. This is the minimum that produces reliable conclusions about parenting behavior. Lena had not done this. Sandra was going to. Cecily and Owen came home the Tuesday after the hearing. I had the afternoon cleared. I was standing in the kitchen when they came in, and Cecily dropped her bag in the entryway and stood there for a moment looking at me with the evaluative stillness she has when she is deciding whether something is actually what it appears to be. Owen walked past all of that directly to the refrigerator and said he was hungry. I stood between the two of them in the kitchen that was my kitchen in the house that was my house, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for a long time, and I made sandwiches. My first session with Sandra was straightforward. She was in her mid-50s and had the specific quality of professional presence that comes from years of sitting across from people in contested situations, attentive without warmth, organized without rigidity, carrying no visible assumption about who you were before you walked in. She asked about my professional history at the outset, which is standard, and I gave it to her fully, including the committee position. She noted it without visible reaction, which I respected. A good evaluator does not perform indifference to information but also does not allow visible responses to signal what they are concluding. She asked me to describe my daily life with my children. Not the schedule, though she asked for that separately. The texture of it. I described Cecily's particular kind of mind and what I had built around it over 12 years. I described the specific quality of safety that Owen oriented toward when he was frightened and what I understood about how it had been built and why it existed. I described the morning routines and the dinner table conversations and the particular rituals that had emerged without planning, the ones that exist in every family and that are the actual connective tissue of what family is when it is working. I described what I knew about each of my children with the specificity of someone who has been paying close attention for a long time, because I had been, and the specificity was genuine rather than assembled for the occasion. Sandra listened and wrote and offered nothing. This is correct technique, and I was aware throughout the session of the particular quality of self-consciousness that comes from sitting on this side of a forensic interview, from knowing that your words are being processed against a clinical framework by someone you cannot see into. I have administered this quality of attention to hundreds of people over 20 years. I had never been the person receiving it. The experience was instructive in ways that I have since incorporated into how I teach forensic interviewing to residents, because understanding what the interview feels like from inside it changes how you conduct it from outside. My first observational session with Sandra was in a family room at her office suite, a space designed to approximate naturalness within the limits of what a clinical setting can approximate. Cecily and Owen came with me. Sandra sat in the corner with a notepad and observed and did not direct and did not intervene. Owen organized a card game within approximately 4 minutes of sitting down. This is characteristic. Owen's response to an unfamiliar situation is to create a structured activity that gives everyone a role, which is both a social skill and a way of managing his own uncertainty, and I have always found this quality in him both practically useful and emotionally revealing. Cecily resisted the card game initially, as she usually does, and read from the book she had brought, and then joined at approximately the 20-minute mark, which is also characteristic. What happened in the last hour of the session was not something I arranged. About 50 minutes in, Cecily put her cards down and looked at me and said she had been thinking about something. I asked what. She said she had been wondering about whether you could ever actually know what another person was feeling, or whether you were always constructing something based on what they showed you. I told her that question was one of the central problems of my field. She asked what my field thought the answer was. I said the field had not reached a consensus, but that the working position most practitioners held was that you could develop reliable knowledge about another person's emotional state through sustained, careful attention over time, and that the reliability increased with the quality of the attention and the duration of the relationship. She thought about that. She said, so it's like any other kind of knowledge. You can be wrong, but being careful makes you less wrong. I said yes. Exactly that. She nodded. She picked up her cards. Owen had been listening to this exchange with the quality of attention he deploys when a conversation is going somewhere he can tell matters, the specific focused quiet that comes over him before he says something that surprises you. He said, "Mom, you're really good at paying attention." I said I had worked at it for a long time. He said, "I know. I can tell." Sandra in the corner wrote something down. Sandra submitted her evaluation to the court 8 weeks after her appointment. Her document ran to 51 pages. I read it in Patricia's conference room on a Thursday afternoon with Patricia across the table not speaking, and I read it with the clinical detachment I had spent 20 years developing, and that detachment held through most of the document and then stopped holding at a specific place. The place was in the observational section of Chapter 4. Sandra had written, "In the first structured observational session, Dr. Ashford demonstrated a quality of attentional presence that is notable in the context of this evaluation and consistent across both sessions." When her daughter raised a question concerning the epistemological foundations of empathy, Dr. Ashford engaged directly and without performance, remaining in the inquiry with the child rather than redirecting or resolving it prematurely. The daughter's engagement in this exchange, her willingness to pursue the question in the presence of an observer she had not previously met, is consistent with a secure relational base in which intellectual vulnerability is safe. This kind of engagement is not a behavior that is reliably rehearsed, it reflects a relational orientation that has been constructed through long, consistent practice. The younger child sustained physical proximity to his mother throughout both sessions, his uninstructed inclusion of her in play activities, and his spontaneous expression of observed attunement suggest secure attachment characterized by durability and consistency. Dr. Ashford did not manage these interactions. She inhabited them. The distinction is clinically significant. I read that paragraph and then I put the document down and looked at the east wall of the conference room for a moment. Patricia waited. Outside the windows the park was doing what parks do in October, going amber and gold and indifferent to anything happening in the buildings around it. Then I picked the document back up and kept reading. The conclusions were organized in the same 3-category structure Lena's evaluation had used, because the structure is the standard, and the standard is mine. On emotional regulation, Dr. Ashford presents with a characteristically measured emotional register that reflects her professional formation and context and does not constitute pathology. No evidence of disproportionate reactivity was observed across 8 clinical contact hours. Affective constriction, while present, is situationally appropriate and does not impair relational function or parenting behavior. On relational stability, Dr. Ashford maintains secure and differentiated attachment relationships with both children, characterized by consistent availability within a measured relational style. The elder child's willingness to raise vulnerability in the observational context indicates a relational history in which being seen is experienced as safe. The younger child's orientation toward his mother in moments of uncertainty indicates a durable trust base. Neither observation is consistent with the characterization of long-standing parental distance offered by the opposing party's declaration materials. On parenting capacity, Dr. Ashford demonstrates parenting that is active, differentiated, and attuned to the specific psychological needs of each child. Professional investment does not negate parenting capacity and does not, in this case, appear to have done so. The observed interactions reflect a parent who has built something specific and durable with each child that is consistent across contexts and appears to the evaluator to be foundational to each child's sense of relational security. A primary residential disruption that removed or significantly reduced access to this parent would represent a destabilizing loss that is not supported by the clinical evidence. No recommendation for sole custody for the opposing party. No clinical finding of parental inadequacy. No support for the characterization Lena's evaluation had built. Patricia watched me set the document down. She said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Careful." She said, "That's still the right answer." She was right to say it. Because the evaluation was significant but the proceedings were not finished, and I had developed, over the preceding months, a reliable understanding of how Garrett responded to information that contradicted his position, and the evaluation contradicted his position substantially, and his response was entirely predictable. His attorney filed a motion for a supplemental evaluation within 10 days of Sandra's submission. The stated basis was new information, a declaration from Garrett claiming that during the evaluation period I had discussed the proceedings with Cecily in a manner that had shaped her presentation to Sandra, constituting a coaching interference with the evaluation's independence. This was not true. I had told Cecily, before the evaluation began, that Dr. Peel was a professional who had been asked to spend time with our family in order to understand it better, and that the most useful thing she and Owen could do was simply be themselves. I had not told her what to say. I had not told her what Dr. Peel was looking for or what the evaluation was for in the legal sense. I had not discussed the custody proceedings with her in any substantive way, because I do not believe that children should carry the weight of adult legal conflicts, and because Cecily's particular kind of intelligence would have registered coaching as coaching and it would have produced exactly the opposite of the natural engagement Sandra had observed. What had happened in the observational session was not coached. It was what Cecily does when she is comfortable. She thinks out loud with someone she trusts. She had been doing it since she was 6 years old. It is one of the things I know best about her. Patricia filed an opposition. The opposition was clear and direct and supported by my own declaration describing the content of my pre-evaluation conversation with Cecily, which was the entirety of what had taken place. It also attached, in an appendix, a summary of the full proceeding record, the original evaluation, its procedural deficiencies, the identity and training history of the evaluator who produced it, the methodology standards that evaluation had violated, the court's exclusion ruling, and the appointment of Sandra under court mandate. Patricia asked the court to consider not just the supplemental evaluation motion but the pattern the full record revealed about how this proceeding had been conducted by one party. Garrett's attorney responded with a motion to strike the appendix on the grounds that it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the supplemental evaluation question. Judge Adler denied the motion to strike. She set a hearing. The hearing was 3 weeks later. In those 3 weeks I continued to see my children on the alternating schedule, continued to go to work, continued to teach and advise and publish and chair committee meetings and do all the things that constituted my professional life, and continued to hold all of it alongside the legal proceedings with the quality of compartmentalization that is both a professional skill and, in this context, a survival mechanism. One evening in the second week Cecily was doing homework at the kitchen table and Owen was nominally also doing homework but was actually mostly reading a comic book that he had placed strategically beneath his worksheet. I was reviewing committee materials at the other end of the table. The house was quiet in the particular way it is quiet when everyone in it is occupied with their own work and the occupation itself is companionable. Cecily looked up from her worksheet and said without preamble, "Mom, are you going to win?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the version that was reassuring and the version that was accurate, and I chose accuracy because Cecily has always been able to distinguish between them and because I had decided early in this process that I was not going to lie to my children about the seriousness of what was happening, even while I protected them from the details. I said, "I think the judge is going to look at everything that has been done and everything that has been said and see it clearly. And I think when she sees it clearly, she's going to make a good decision." Cecily considered this for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds like yes but careful." I said, "That's a very accurate reading." She looked at me for another moment with the assessing quality she has, and then she went back to her worksheet. Owen, from behind his comic book, said, "I think you're going to win." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're always right about stuff." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "That's very kind of you and also not always true." He turned a page. He said, "It's true enough." I went back to my committee materials. The house was quiet and correctly itself around us, and I let that be what it was. The hearing on the supplemental evaluation motion was the last formal proceeding before Judge Adler issued her custody determination. By the time we walked into that courtroom I had been inside this legal process for 5 months, and I had learned things during those 5 months that I did not know before them, not about law or procedure or forensic methodology, those I already knew, but about the specific texture of fighting for something that should not have required a fight. About the exhaustion that comes not from any single event but from the sustained low-level vigilance of not knowing what the outcome is going to be. About the particular discipline required to remain accurate and measured and professionally precise when what is at stake is the daily presence of your children in your life. I had also learned something I am going to try to say carefully, because it sits at the border between professional insight and personal understanding, and I am not always certain I have the language for what is on the personal side. I learned that I had underestimated, for years, the weight of what I had built with my children. Not in the sense of not valuing it. I valued it. But valuing something and understanding its structural significance are different operations, and I had not fully understood until Sandra's evaluation described what she had observed in those 2 sessions, that what Cecily and Owen carried with them from our relationship was something that had been built deliberately and specifically and over a long time, and that it was the kind of thing that would sustain them in circumstances I would not be there for. That is not the same as being always present. It is something different. And the process of having it challenged, of sitting with the possibility that a court might not see it, had taught me to understand its specific nature and value in a way that I had not before. This did not make the process worth what it cost. I want to be clear about that. But it was what I took from it that was real. Patricia and I arrived 45 minutes early. We sat in the small room off the main corridor that family court lawyers use as waiting spaces before hearings, and she went through the argument structure one more time, not because I had forgotten it but because reviewing it with her was the way she settled herself before a hearing, and I had learned to find her preparation rituals useful for my own steadiness. Patricia is not a performative attorney. She does not project confidence or project anything. She prepares carefully and then she is present, and presence is what matters in a courtroom. The core of our argument was this: the court had before it a motion asking it to discount the findings of a court-appointed evaluator who had followed correct procedure on the basis of an allegation about the evaluated party's pre-evaluation behavior. This allegation was unverified, contradicted by the evaluated party's sworn declaration, and came from a party whose prior conduct in the proceeding included commissioning an evaluation that failed 3 procedural requirements, framing those sessions deceptively to the opposing party, failing to disclose the financial relationship between the requesting party and the evaluator, and hiring as an evaluator a person who had been professionally trained by the subject of the evaluation using a methodology authored by that subject without disclosing any of this to the court or opposing counsel. That was the pattern. We were asking the judge to see the pattern. Garrett was at his table when we came in. He looked at me and I looked at him, and there was something in that exchange that was not legal or procedural, that was simply the look of 2 people who had been married for a long time and had done this to each other, and then it was over and I sat down beside Patricia and opened my folder. His attorney opened by arguing the supplemental motion on its stated merits. He characterized my conversation with Cecily as a coaching intervention designed to influence her presentation to a neutral evaluator. He used the word coaching 4 times in 8 minutes. He described Cecily's engagement in the observational session as rehearsed, a word Sandra had specifically and directly contradicted in her written evaluation, which meant he was arguing against the court-appointed evaluator's professional judgment, which is a position that requires significant confidence in the strength of your underlying case. Judge Adler asked him what specific evidence he had that the pre-evaluation conversation between Dr. Ashford and her daughter had gone beyond factual disclosure of the evaluation's existence. He cited Cecily's behavior in the observational session as circumstantial evidence. The judge asked whether Dr. Peel's evaluation had addressed the authenticity of the observed behaviors. He said the evaluation's credibility was precisely what was at issue. The judge looked at him for a moment. She said, "You are asking me to discount the findings of a court-appointed evaluator, appointed at your client's request after the first evaluation was excluded, on the basis of a declaration by your client that the opposing party influenced the evaluator's findings. Is that correct?" He said that was essentially the position. The judge turned to Patricia. Patricia argued without heat, in the precise and methodical way she argued everything. She walked the court through the sequence: the original evaluation, its deficiencies, the exclusion ruling, the appointment of Sandra under court mandate, Sandra's procedural compliance, Sandra's findings, and then the motion now before the court. She noted that the motion rested on an unverified allegation by the party who had already submitted one procedurally deficient evaluation to this proceeding, and asked the court to consider that full sequence. Then Patricia turned to me and asked me to take the stand. I had testified in courts more times than I could number. I had sat in the expert witness position in family courts and criminal courts and probate hearings, had been qualified as an expert in forensic psychiatry and competency assessment in multiple jurisdictions, had been cross-examined by attorneys whose preparation had ranged from excellent to careless. I had never before sat in the witness chair in a case about myself. Patricia asked me to identify myself professionally. I said, Renata Ashford, professor and chair of the Department of Psychiatric Medicine at Whitmore Medical School. Current chair of the National Standards Committee of the American Association of Forensic Psychiatry. Lead author of the foundational paper on competency assessment in family court proceedings, Journal of Forensic Psychiatry, 2011. Contributing author of the 2013 clinical textbook on custody evaluation. Drafting committee chair for the 2019 National Standards Guidelines for Forensic Psychiatric Evaluation, currently in effect in this jurisdiction and 14 others. Patricia asked me to look at the citations in the methodology section of the Holt evaluation, which had been entered into the record as an exhibit, and confirm whether I recognized the documents cited. I confirmed that I had authored or co-authored all three. She asked me to describe the procedural requirements those documents contained for custody evaluation cases. I described them. All three requirements, in plain and specific language, the way I describe clinical material to a jury, which is clearly and without jargon and with the specific care of someone who understands that comprehension is a form of respect. She asked me whether those requirements had been satisfied in the evaluation that had subsequently been excluded by this court. I said no. And I explained why, with specific reference to each requirement and the specific provision it corresponded to in each document. Patricia asked me whether the evaluator who had produced the excluded evaluation, Dr. Lena Holt, had received her training in forensic psychiatry under my supervision. I said yes. Whether the methodological framework Dr. Holt had applied in the evaluation was one she had been taught, in significant part, through my teaching and supervision. Yes. Whether Dr. Holt had, to my knowledge, disclosed any of this to the court or to opposing counsel when the evaluation was submitted. No. Patricia sat down. Garrett's attorney cross-examined me on one point: whether a former supervisor could be a reliable self-interest party in an assessment of a former trainee's methodological competence. It was a reasonable question and I answered it directly. I said that my assessment of the methodological failures in the excluded evaluation was based on specific, documented, verifiable procedural requirements, not on professional judgment about Dr. Holt's competence generally, and that any practitioner with access to the same documents could reach the same conclusions, and that the court had in fact reached the same conclusions when it excluded the evaluation, which suggested the assessment was accurate rather than self-interested. He had no follow-up question. I returned to my seat. Garrett was very still at his table. His attorney sat down beside him and said something quietly, and Garrett looked at the table. Judge Adler wrote for some time. Then she looked up. She denied the motion for supplemental evaluation. She said the existing court-appointed evaluation had been conducted with procedural care and professional independence and that there was no substantive basis for questioning its findings. She noted that the declaration underlying the motion was unverified and was offered by a party with a documented interest in the outcome, and that it was contradicted by the sworn declaration of the opposing party and by the professional judgment of the court's own appointed evaluator. She said she was prepared to issue her custody determination at this hearing unless either party had a reason she had not yet heard to delay. Neither party had one. Judge Adler issued a shared legal custody arrangement. Primary residential custody would alternate on a 2-week schedule, adjusted for each parent's professional travel calendar. Major decisions required agreement between both parties, with a formal dispute resolution process if agreement could not be reached. Neither party had sole custody. The children would remain in their current school. The arrangement would be reviewed if either party filed a petition for modification supported by a material change in circumstances. We walked out of the courthouse into an October afternoon that was brighter and colder than I had expected. Patricia and I stood on the steps for a moment. She said, "That's a good outcome." "Not perfect." "Good." I said I knew. She said, "You did this well." I thanked her. I meant it. She went back inside to collect her materials and I stood on the steps a few minutes longer. The city was doing what it does in October, going about its ordinary business in the particular amber light of that season, and I stood in it and breathed and thought about what had just happened and what it meant and what came next. I thought about Lena. I have thought about her at several points in this account and I want to say clearly what I think, because clarity is what I owe anyone who has stayed with this story. Lena made a professional error. She accepted a referral framed by a requesting party. She did not ask enough questions about the context of the sessions, she did not satisfy the procedural requirements of the standards she cited, and she produced a document that failed on multiple grounds. These are real failures, and they had real consequences in a proceeding about my children's lives, and I do not minimize them. I also believe she did not set out to harm anyone. I believe she was given a narrative by a man who is skilled at constructing compelling narratives, and she did not interrogate it with the rigor she would have applied if she had understood what she was inside. I believe that when she understood the full picture, the authorship of the standards document, the training relationship, the procedural failures, it landed on her with professional weight. I hope it changed how she practices. I hope she reads every referral framing more carefully now. I hope she asks harder questions before the sessions begin rather than after the evaluation is submitted to a court. The standards exist for a reason. The reason is that children are the stakes. Children who have not chosen to be inside legal proceedings, who did not design the families they were born into or the conflicts those families developed, who deserve that the people making determinations about their lives are doing so with the greatest possible accuracy and the smallest possible procedural error. The requirements I spent years developing on that committee were not bureaucratic decoration. They were the minimum conditions under which the conclusions could be trusted. Lena had not met them. The court had recognized that. And now we were here. I picked my children up from school that afternoon. Cecily got in the car and looked at me and said, "It went okay, didn't it?" I said yes. "It went okay." She nodded. She put her headphones on. Owen handed me a paper crane he had made in art class. He said it was for good luck, but he had made it after school, so technically it was for good luck retroactively, and he was not sure that was how luck worked, but he thought it was worth trying. I drove home through streets that were familiar and ordinary. The crane sat on the dashboard and Owen talked about whether retroactive luck was a coherent concept, and Cecily had her headphones on and occasionally looked up to note that Owen's argument had a logical problem. The ordinary noise and motion of my children in my car on an ordinary afternoon. I have thought many times since then about what I would say to another person going through something like this, and what I keep coming back to is not strategic or legal or even professional. It is this: know what you have built. Not what you have scheduled or provided or arranged. What you have actually built with the people who matter most to you, the specific and invisible things that live in trust and attention and the long patience of being reliably present in the ways that presence counts. Know it well enough to describe it. Know it well enough to defend it. Know it well enough that when someone tries to characterize you in language that is not entirely false but is catastrophically incomplete, you can hold the full truth of what you know against their selected fragment of it and understand which one is real. And when someone uses your own work against you, understand that you still know it better than they do. That has not changed. If this story found you in a moment when you needed to hear that fighting for your children with precision and patience and the fullness of what you actually know is worth doing, then I am glad you stayed with it. Share it with someone who might need it. Leave your own story in the comments. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe, because there are more to tell, and every one of them belongs to someone who survived something they were told they could not. I am glad I did.